Welcome back. Money in general and giving in particular are taboo subjects in the church. Why do you think that is?
In our culture, our society, we're very much individualistic, and we value privacy for one thing. I think partly we value privacy because that heightens our freedom. In other words, privacy is sort of a counterbalance to accountability. The less accountable you are, the more privacy you have, the less you sort of have to be accountable for what you do and the choices that you make. That's good insofar as it gives us freedom. It's not so good insofar as in terms of allowing us to do the things that perhaps we shouldn't be able to do quite so freely. In the church, we simply carry over the values of our culture in many ways, I think, with regard to money. Our wealth, our income, particularly our financial wealth, is very much a personal matter because it relates directly to how we live, the lifestyle choices we make, and the deep convictions that we have in our society, in our culture, that maximum personal freedom is a good thing, is a virtue. That carries over into the church, and so the cultural value of privacy and freedom manifest themselves in how we deal with that in the church. It's an awkward subject, it's a difficult subject, and it's very difficult to talk about giving or any other issue related to wealth from a biblical standpoint without really getting at the heart of or even attacking some of those expectations that we have that our wealth is ours, and we should be free to do with it whatever we want.
The Apostle Paul talked about giving in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Can you talk us through that passage?
It's a great verse. It may be one of the pivotal or central verses regarding giving in the New Testament. And Paul, he really fleshes out some of the principles, particularly moving on from the parables and the teaching of Jesus, and sets them in a very particular historical context. So you've got the famine taking place in Jerusalem, and the Christians, the believers back in the home church, in a sense, in Jerusalem, are suffering because of a famine through Palestine. And you have the believers, this small group of Christians, and not particularly wealthy people in Macedonia, who've raised this gift, this, in a sense, famine relief, contribution from the offerings that they've collected to give to their brothers and sisters in Palestine. And as Paul says, they raised from what they had, and not according to some sense of obligation, but out of a desire, out of their own free will. They gave because they really wanted to give. And they were sensitive to the particular, very critical needs of the believers, of the Christians back in Palestine, back in Jerusalem. And then he goes on to that. Of course, he's talking to the Corinthians about this example. And he's using it as an example to show the Corinthians what giving really ought to look like and what it should be about. He uses the Macedonians partly because they weren't very well off. So there's an understanding that these were poor people, or these were certainly people with limited means, who nevertheless didn't think that it was anything at all for them to give of what they had willingly for the sake of those people who needed in Jerusalem. And then Paul goes on at the end of that passage, and he talks about how they gave according to what they had. And he's telling the Corinthians, and you should give according to what you have for those who need now, so that when they have and you don't, they can give for you. They can supply your need. The whole thing is, of course, very much this reciprocal kind of relationship arrangement, where seeing the needs of others, we respond based on their need, first and foremost, not based on a sort of a initial assessment of what do I have that I can give, but it's a concern for what they need. And then looking to see, well, what has God provided? And that's really the question, not what do I have, but what has God provided that I can help to give toward that need? That's kind of at the heart of this passage. And it's Paul, in a sense, what Paul is getting at is the whole orientation of thinking that looks at the situation in terms of how can we help those with whom we have this strong link, to whom we're tied spiritually. rather than, well, what do I have? Or what do I have extra? Or what maybe do I have left over that's surplus to me? He's saying, God has provided for the Macedonians, and in their willingness to give, they've recognized his gift to them so that they have a gift to others. And if you live with that orientation, you will not only see opportunities to care for others, but you will recognize God has made provision for you in your time of need through the gifts that others will give for you as well. It's a great picture. Now, what happens is, or where I see a link with this passage and what John Wesley goes on to talk about in his sermon, The Use of Money, and really largely what's behind much of what Randy Alcorn has written in his book, is it's the whole orientation of the heart. It's the recognition that, one, God is generous, not stingy and not sort of eking out to us what we can barely get by with, but he's profoundly generous. He's extravagantly generous, looking always to give and to provide. But he's doing it in such a way that ties us to each other, so that we're caring for each other as a reflection of the way that he cares for us. And both in terms of Wesley's sermon, where he talks about, in a sense, a little bit surprisingly, encouraging Christians to get as much as they can, to gain as much wealth, material wealth as they can, so that they're in a good position to be generous with that wealth and to care for, to provide for the needs of others. It's that same orientation of the heart and thinking. God has provided generously for us so that we can provide for others. And making those choices actually shapes us. It makes us into different people who derive a progressively greater satisfaction from what we're able to give rather than what we provide for ourselves.